Welcome, and thank you for joining us at this morning's offer. So just very quickly, I'm sure everybody is aware what CDE is, but I'm just going to quickly run through a few things and just talk about why this session is particularly important strategically for Culture Declares. So we're a growing community of arts and cultural champions declaring a climate and ecological emergency. We face the truth, take action together, and seek justice in response to the emergency. Since the launch last April, there are now over 900 individuals and organisations who've declared an emergency through CDE, and a growing network of other movements like music, architecture and heritage. As you'll all know, that we provide toolkits and amplification and a kite mark and a kind of template for potential declarers. So since last year, obviously it's grown into a hugely successful movement, and there's been a lot of work on future strategy, and the important thing from here on in is to make sure everybody feels mandated to take initiatives locally, because the local elements of this work is absolutely vital. So I'm hoping today some of you will be inspired to start some initiatives of your own, or at least join or hook up with people who are already making actions in your area. So I'm going to hand you over to Mike Pryor, Anna Davidson and Farhana Yamin, who have all successfully achieved initiatives in their own area with growing success, and which is hugely inspiring for everybody. I'm going to ask Farhana to speak first about Think and Do, and more broadly why, in her eyes, these pop-ups and initiatives are so very important. So Farhana.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to see. Am I unmuted? Yeah. So lovely to see so many faces that I've come across and had the benefit of being very supported in this journey that so many of us are on, actually, especially since last year when I came across some of the people here who went on to form Culture Declares Emergency, and local friends as well. So you're all very much part of this Think and Do journey, which has really come about, I think, from this growing movement that you described of a whole range of bodies, from national governments to local authorities to professional bodies, individuals who decided that they were in an emergency, recognized that emergency, recognized the nature of the climate and ecological crisis, and decided to act. Often without permission, and then decided what and how in their individual lives, their professional lives, and in their lives as community leaders and as thought leaders, what should come next. I'm just going to share my screen with you a little bit, because I did have some slides that I put together for a few other groups. Can you see those slides? Is my screen okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. So so my slide, the title of it, and I'll take not too long. Yeah, it's basically the biggest recognition, actually, dawning on people living here in the UK, but globally, was the need to really embed and unite the different movements that were working on the social, economic, financial, and other aspects of what a fundamental reset of the economy looks like. This was happening years ago. This is not something that is just happening now. I think the realization that COVID has reinforced is how much of the existing system was very, very unfair, and very put a lot of people under a hugely stressful thing. So I think the realization that climate justice required everyone to act faster to tackle the climate and ecological emergency, and that required building a much bigger movement of flourishing communities, came some time ago, and was really the bedrock of, I think, why so many of us met up and decided to do that. I'm not going to look at this slide. So the climate emergency, I'm going to just say that as shorthand for the nature emergency. Actually, climate and nature go hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin. New leaders have emerged, and protests and people power have already shifted blockages enormously. So this is the map, which is again constantly updated, and I have to move you all to read the numbers. So at, you know, roughly, I think it's nearly 1,400, but higher probably, jurisdictions that have declared an emergency of some kind. Many different countries are doing that. The number of local authorities, this is showing the UK picture, and again, it's, you know, is updated all the time. The vast majority of local authorities and the vast majority of the population of the UK is living under local authorities or cities that have declared a climate and ecological emergency. And the UK Citizens Assembly, which got put on hold for the last of its meetings, has had that last weekend of online Zoom meetings, and is a demand that came up very much around last year for citizens to be much more actively engaged in deciding the nature of the action that had to be taken and how it impacted them and what should be done. So moving very quickly to Camden. So Camden was one of the councils that started to examine what it would do in response to the climate and ecological emergency. One of the organisations that I co-convene is called Dartmouth Park Talks, and we had in May of last year, the 6th of May actually, the leader of our council, Georgia Gould. We had Ed Miliband, who lives around the corner, and we had Sian Berry, who is very prominent in the Green Party and in the London Local Assembly, all come with me. We had a discussion about what does it mean for climate, for Camden to be in a climate and ecological emergency. And one of the ideas that came out was obviously to have a Citizens Assembly, but also to go beyond the Citizens Assembly. A Citizens Assembly are very formal proceedings, actually. You know, most of you know what they are now. They're, you know, sortition, lot-based deliberations, often lasting 3 or 4 weekends, or 50 to 100 or 300 people, depending on how big your budget and need is. And they have a start and a finish and an end and come to some conclusions, but there usually isn't a sort of direct follow-up. So at this meeting back in May, we started looking at, and I was very much pushing the council to have a follow-up to any Citizens Assembly that would be incorporated and would encourage and engage mobilised citizens, active citizens, to take forward solutions. So the reason why we, you know, so basically over the summer months, Camden had their Citizens Assembly. It came up with conclusions. Those conclusions were deliberated and adopted by the full council on the 14th of October. And already ahead of that 14th of October meeting, we had agreed behind the scenes that we would launch a follow-up process, and that we wouldn't just let the Citizens Assembly spirit sort of die, as it were. Many of those citizens themselves said, you know, we're really excited about what we've learned, and we want to see a space where that can happen. So the space that we chose, in fact, there were 2 spaces that were going. One was the picture that you see now, which was a rundown closed cafe called Flapjacks that had been closed for almost a year at that point in time, and which the council had a 6-month lease still on that premises. And the other was a much bigger building, which is just up the road from Kentish Town Tube Station, called number 19 Highgate Road, which the council had earmarked as a purpose-built community centre, bringing lots of groups together, but which wasn't going to be ready, in fact, for now, April of this year. So we're looking at from, you know, November, sort of October, to waiting until April. And many of us then said, we don't want to wait till April. We want to act now, because being in an ecological emergency means that you act now. You don't wait around and wait another 6 months to start doing something. So that idea that we should all pile in really and act with haste really encouraged the council to become a very active collaborator. Their property department, their sustainability department, their all of the different teams, you know, participation teams, sustainability team, everyone piled in, and we, with the community support, especially key groups like Transition Kentish Town, and all of the Camden sort of groups, Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, many others, Culture Declares as well, piled in and said, okay, we will do what's necessary to convert this high street shop into something which is a new space. And that was very much part of the thinking, was to try and encourage new ways of reimagining our existing spaces, existing urban spaces, existing social spaces, existing community spaces, and to generate new forms of commons, new forms of community, new ways of making the high street a place where climate action, sustainable development goal action were visible. You know, these are the big goals that drive us, but they are not very visible in the high street. And, you know, to have a way in which Camden could also not just be held accountable in a sort of traditional adversarial NGO sense, you know, the council, you're not doing enough, you know, why haven't you done this, why haven't you done that? There's a really valid role for that, but to also have a space where collaborative efforts could take root, and where the council supported the sorts of initiatives where individuals find it difficult to do on their own, or community groups kind of find it difficult to do on their own, but where there could be sort of collaborations. So Think and Do is very much birthed from the climate emergency sort of setting, and it's very much birthed around supporting formal bodies like a council and others take action. It has, I would say, smaller roots in the cultural pop-ups that had been happening for many years, actually, which I learned about, which some of you, many of you have been sort of active in. And so we feel very much here that this much wider group of people who came forward, this wider group of community groups that came forward, you know, go beyond just the cultural sector, and we want to provide a sort of neutral space to hold all of the different groups together. And Think and Do is a deliberate label which is aimed at being available to everybody, because everybody needs to rethink their lives. Everyone wants to do something. So thinking and doing differently is the common thing that we have right now that we can all sort of unite around. And it's basically the two, you know, hallmarks of being human is thinking and doing together. And we don't want to separate out the thinkers from the doers, which is again a thing that has happened, and very much in the, not just in the climate movement, but in many movements, there's a sort of, you know, a grassroots sort of set of people who are generally, you know, very different, and kind of the Cinderellas of the grass tops or the policy advocacy, you know, sort of people. And I wanted very much to avoid that. So there's lots of, I'm very happy to send these slides, some lovely pictures here summarizing what happened in the first phase, which was only meant to be a 6-week phase. The council committed to 6 weeks of staff and support time, which ran from November to December, and we persuaded them to then extend and give us the shop until at least the release runs out, which is sort of next week basically. We held over 80 different events during that 6 weeks. Since then, which is probably what you're more interested in, we restarted the process of having events in February and March, but obviously COVID ended the physical space from being used for those events. And so since then we've gone online, as have many of you. This is now our 3rd week of offering Zoom seminars on a whole load of different things: food, local activism, culture. We had Judy as well last 2 weeks ago. We're partnering now with an organisation that has sprung up and literally overnight in 7 days set up a care delivery package at number 19, which is the new space that will function. And we're in the middle of now pivoting towards what can be done in that new space, which is sort of ready but can't actually be used right now, and planning a whole number of projects. In the last couple of weeks, and I'll just end it there, we've got you know, about 90 ideas for projects that came up during phase 1 and phase 2, and some of those are now beginning to happen. Some are quite well-formed projects with little teams and people taking them forward. Others are, you know, still you know, just ideas without teams to take them forward. We're sort of trying to figure all of that out. There's you know, we see very much Think and Do as a prototype, as an experimental space. And the space was always, and the idea behind it was always to encourage everyone else to copy and organize their own Think and Do's, and to give a little bit of support and to say, this is how we've managed to do what we've done. We've been very fortunate in the sense that we've had a very supportive council behind us, putting resources, time, effort, staff into this, but it's still very much volunteer based. There's no official funding. We're trying to get funding now, which is probably more likely, ironically, now that the funders all understand COP26 is delayed and that communities are, you know, the way forward in terms of delivering, you know, tailor-made, bespoke, you know, nuanced, locally embedded actions. So that's the story up to date. I think I've taken quite a lot of time, so I'll end it there. And very happy to share the slides and some of the things that we've written about, and very happy for others to question us and support basically the rollout of this. You know, it's another type of pop-up, and to you know, in any way encourage you to be in touch with us and see what we can provide you in terms of support. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Farhana. I think we're just going to go straight on to Anna now to talk about Kirklees.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yeah. Farhana, do you mind?
Oh, yeah, that's great. It's done.
Great.
Thank you so much, Farhana. It was great to hear about the Think and Do, because it offered a lot of inspiration for activities in Kirklees. So I just want to introduce what Mike Pryor and I will talk about for a few minutes in terms of the Kirklees activities. We'll first kind of talk about the origins, so where ideas came from for Kirklees activities, then talk about some of the events that we've organised, and then think about next steps, so what's coming next, both in light of activities we've done, but also in light of COVID-19. And that's also when we want to get into breakouts and hear more from everyone about their local plans too, because we've already, before we started this, heard a bit about local groups that are coming up and wanting to do pop-ups and local initiatives. But first, before we get started, I should say a little bit about myself. I'm Anna Davidson. When thinking about it, I've been doing local climate action for more than 20 years. And I'm a geography lecturer, so I kind of do climate action related things in my day-to-day life as well. But before we start, I wanted to also do a bit of an icebreaker. So just to get everyone kind of taking part just a little bit, if you could either do this in the chat box or do it in a piece of paper like this, just answering 2 questions. So the first one is one word or a smiley about how you're feeling right now. So I don't know if that's in mirror image or if you can see it, but I'm cold. It's one of the perils of working in a Victorian house, trying to be eco-friendly. And the other question is, what are you here for? You know, what are you hoping to learn today? What brought you here? So if you could either type it in the chat box to everybody, so we can all sort of get a sense of what, you know, how everyone's feeling, one word. And the second one is share why you're here today. All right, if everyone can kind of keep them coming if you've not yet written them. And if I pass on to Mike Pryor, is that all right? And Mike can start us off with speaking about the origins and inspirations for activities in Kirklees.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. That's great. Good icebreaker. I enjoyed that. I think so. I'm Mike Pryor. I'm with Anna and Jenny and Selena on the call, involved in the Kirklees Culture Declares network. I'll show you the map of our local network shortly, and Anna will give you a flavour, as she said, of the pop-up, the recent pop-up we had in March later on. But just so that people know where we are, we're in the South Pennines. We're just in the middle of a triangle between Leeds in the north, Sheffield to the southeast, and Manchester to the southwest. So with the benefit of hindsight, the origins of our local community here in Kirklees can be traced back to about 4 sources. So I'd like to pay homage to those 4 sources to start off with. First and foremost, back in March last year, Victoria spoke to me about this emerging movement, Culture Declares Emergency. And I was intrigued as Kirklees Council had just declared one of the declarations, as Farhana mentioned, that were coming through last year. So the Culture Declares Anchor Circle was to become for us, and still is, a great source of support and inspiration. It really needs to be said that we couldn't have done this without that kind of backup from the Culture Declares national and global network. So the School of Architecture at Huddersfield University, where Anna works, regularly reaches out into the local community with exhibitions in our adjacent public market. So there's a gallery space amongst the market stalls called Temporary Contemporary. And in March last year, this exhibition captured my imagination. It took a radical look at Huddersfield's town centre from 3 different perspectives. 2 of them are shown here on the slide: Greening Huddersfield and Festive Huddersfield. And the other one, imagine how street art could enliven and beautify neglected public space. Seen together, all 3 seem to channel what Extinction Rebellion would do the following month on Waterloo Bridge. But it really inspired me, this one. And I think Davidson, who did the festive one, talked about pop-ups and using courtyards and community spaces. It was a brilliant exhibition. It's available through the link, I think, in chat. But if you Google or search for Temporary Tactical Urbanism, it'll come up. I think Davidson was also an individual declarer in the first wave of declarations. And there's a link to the, and then later this evening, Ioanni Del Sante, who's a lecturer at the university, and he led the team behind this, but he's also leading the evening offer this evening. So hopefully see you there. On the next slide, this talks about our sort of what we did within the Letters to the Earth campaign. So in March, I'd been planning ahead to go to the International Rebellion in London. But when I heard from Victoria about Culture Declare's global call out for Letters to the Earth, I switched focus and booked a venue to host readings, and we started drumming up an audience. I still went to Marble Arch as it happened, but that's a different story. I think what we did, we love this slide, this poster here in Huddersfield, because it basically shows the Ukrainian club surrounded by such prestigious other venues. And the Ukrainian club is a prestigious venue, but such exotic landmarks in cosmopolitan places, so we like that. On the night of the 12th of April, we had 40 guests. So the next slide gives a flavour of what the event looked like. We showed a lot of short films. Could we click on the next one, please? Thanks. We showed a lot of short films, and we had vegan food. Sorry, back to the photographs. Thanks. I'm sorry, I can't. And then we had readings of selected letters to the Earth. And this was by a lot of young people, and we used index cards for people in the audience to share their thoughts and feelings, so a bit like today's chat. The young people on stage would return later in the year to read from the published book, Letters to the Earth, which was great. So we had people from the local asylum seeker charity Dash, and we also had people from the school strikes, from Extinction Rebellion, and it was a good night actually. Everybody enjoyed it. So after the International Rebellion, onto the next slide, XR's book was published, as you'll all know. And while could we just click on to the next one? Thanks. Whilst Farhana's essay is the very first one in part 1 of that book, there's an essay towards the end of the book by Paul Chatterton. Sorry, Victoria, could we just go back to the other slide? So just as Farhana's work with Camden Think and Do went on to inspire our pop-up, sorry, it's just back a little bit to the Extinction Rebellion, but that's the one. Thank you. So this is the one where Paul's article talked about a civic plan for a climate emergency, and again, I think we've got a link to that in the chat. And it was a great spur to our imagination. It urges policymakers to make more radical responses to the climate and ecological emergency. And one of those was to create community hubs. So quite in parallel to what Farhana was doing, we were starting to think about what might be possible here in Huddersfield with Paul Chatterton's work. So from April onwards, I started to trace various arts and cultural organisations across Kirklees and emailed all of them, I think it was over 50, and asking them to join the Culture Declares network. It made me realise just how busy people in arts and culture are, because to get inside someone's professional bubble when people are so busy was really tricky. But we got some good interest, and we called our first meeting at the end of July. And Victoria was very much a big help for us in that. So I'll hand over to Victoria.
Yeah. Well, you're very flattering, Mike. I think much praise to you and to Anna for the amazing work. And I think the network here, flow chart of declarers is incredible. And I think, so I remember going out, it was very, very hot, my son, and we'd been to the sculpture park and having a look around Yorkshire. I think the most important that was to be very inclusive and to not expect anything in advance or on entry from the people who showed up. I think there was some anxiety about declaring and what that entailed, and I think we decided that the best thing to do was to not suggest that declaring was a barrier to joining in, which worked really well. So even within the meeting, you could feel people more or less engaged. Some people just sat and observed, and some people were very much sort of taking a part in it. But from a sort of outsider's point of view, I could see the interest growing, through the couple of hours of the event taking place. And you also had the group who are holding the Declaring Council to account. So it became a very interesting space where sort of conversations between arts and cultural organisations and local authority was already beginning to take place. There were some very practical discussions about events wanting to reduce their stick production. And then I think the important thing people took away was just the cultural and sort of systemic complexity of the climate and ecological emergency, and that if plastic was their way in, they came up with an understanding that there are much bigger issues involved around that. So I think that was a really sort of smart way of approaching being inclusive and welcoming of everybody regardless of why they'd entered the room. And I think the thing that I offered was, at that time I was working with an organisation, arts and science organisation called Invisible Dust, and we just declared, and we changed although Culture Declares provided a template, we'd very much sort of made it our own. So I was able to sort of present that and reassure, I think be reassuring to people there that, that you find your own way through declaring. It can start with small steps. And in fact, from CD's, that we've had a lot of talk within the existing anchor circle about what declaring is. And I think the decision is that journey is entirely down to the individual organisation. Initially, it can simply be a tweet, and that's your entry point. But it was great, and actually, Mike had done a lot of cultivation prior to this event through Letters to the Earth and building relationships with people. Clearly snowballed from there on in. So well done, Mike.
That's good. I think what we did straight after that meeting was to really get everybody behind the fact that we existed as a community. So in July, we were effectively a community. We set up a Twitter account. We started to act more collaboratively. And the first thing we decided to do was the slide that's up at the moment, Declaration Day for 30th of September. We just decided we'd set a day, and this was our first event, effectively. We hosted it at West Yorkshire Print Workshop, and you can see so we'd agreed on that day to make a big splash. We sent press releases to the Yorkshire Post, to the Guardian, and the Huddersfield Examiner, so we had big ambitions. But and we invited the journalists to join us, and we got no response whatsoever, and it was a bit of a shock. But so the Declaration Day was a bit like a scene from Waiting for Godot, a sort of badly directed scene from Waiting to Godot. But we did post 13 declarations to the Culture Declares website, so it helped to galvanise, as Victoria said, it helped to galvanise a local network. As you can see from the familiar flyer on the left there, we remain rooted in the global network Culture Declares and actively use the pledge. We've made the underlying intentions, as you can probably see, a little bit more specific to Kirklees. And because some organisations like, let me just pick a couple out, the Huddersfield Literature Festival, for example, were a little bit nervous about declaring immediately. They had to go through trustees. So we used this declaration, there is no doubt, and the pledge to just say, well, everybody's behind this, and everybody put their hand up and said they were. So we made a declaration as a group as well. So on the network map there, all the green ones had declared at that point. We've doubled that number now, and there's new ones come into play. So I think active members currently, as you can see when Anna talks about the hub, is the museums and galleries, and I think Jenny's on the call today from Kirklees Museums. And underneath, so you can see that Kirklees Museums and libraries have been really crucial to us with our events, and they both sit under the declaration that the council made, so they haven't made a separate declaration. If we go on to the next slide, it shows that November was a great month for us because we had one example of an organisation acting independently. So this slide shows they acted independently on their declaration. Holmfirth Film Festival declared in September. And then we've got, so what they did was they created a set of environmental films under the Kirklees Culture Declares umbrella. And it included, this one included a public discussion. And I think we used the film by Paul Adam, and he came along, Quiet Flows the Don, the transformation of Europe's dirtiest river. So he showed the film and then talked about it in the context of the climate emergency. So I think it's a great example of, you know, Holmfirth Film Festival took this on, they declared, but then they went straight in and acted on it, and we loved that. Their summer festival had a similar format, and that included the incredible short film, which I know Anna's aware of, called Children versus Cars, set in the De Pijp suburbs of Amsterdam in 1972. I'd urge everybody, if they haven't seen it already, just to look at that. It's a short film, but brilliant. The next slide shows how we supported the Letters to the Earth book launch. So we had support from Huddersfield Library and Reed Bookshop in Holmfirth. I think when Grace Pengelly from William Collins and I think Culture Declares called out to published authors to help us, Nick Drake and Rob Cohen responded, and they're brilliant poems and prose. So they read them out with anecdotes, and they went down really well with our audiences on that day. So that was the day of the launch of the book. You can see from the team picture at the library at the bottom right that our young readers came back. So they were at the Ukrainian club and they were keen to be involved again and read letters from the book. Sometimes the letter that they'd read out back in April, which was fantastic. There was a memorable moment before Nick Drake read his untitled poem from the Farewell Glacier. he asked everyone if they knew what an ice core sample was. And I think he was really surprised when young Joseph, who's at the front of this picture, put his hand up and then gave the most astonishing and I think accurate definition of this ice core sample and how scientists are using ice core samples to understand climate change. But it stunned the room, including Nick Drake, into silence. And I think that's the sort of events we've had so far. So I'll hand over to Anna. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mike. And feel free to jump in as we talk about the hub in Huddersfield. I'll still need the slides if that's okay, Victoria.
Oh, hold on a minute.
That's all right. So yeah, I'll just be talking a little bit about the hub that was inspired, in part by the Think and Do in London, but also by Paul Chatterton's book with this idea of climate hubs. So Mike got in touch with me through, I think it was through Paul Chatterton, and because I'd been talking to Paul Chatterton about hubs and the potential of that, and then Mike had read the book, and then Paul put us in touch. And yeah, this is a picture of our hub, which was from the 9th to the 14th of March. And it was actually, in a sense, it was a bit like what Farhana was saying in terms of acting with haste. It was done relatively quickly. I think we first started talking about it in the summer before, but the opportunity came up through the council with this whole area in Huddersfield being up for redevelopment. And so a lot of the shops were empty. So the opportunity was there that a lot of these shops were being used for pop-up art spaces. So any kind of local community, not-for-profit, or, you know, some artists within the university were also being able to use some of these spaces. So we had this opportunity to use the space. We could have used it for longer, but we decided that we wanted a full program of activities. We didn't want to have a couple of hours open on a few days and then nothing. We wanted to really run it from sort of 9 to 5 and even on into the evening for a full week. And so I think it was about in January we decided, right, we're going to do this. So I had about 3 months to put together the program, and it was incredible. The community that Mike had built up really kind of came together, and we had in the run-up we had weekly meetings to really put the program together. So I think if you go to the next slide, you should have a sense of the program. So it might be a little bit too small to see, but you can see that we tried to completely fill it up. So always had somebody there. Often it was Mike himself, and it was in a quite busy kind of public area, so people coming past could just wander in. Sometimes there's people outside the hub, sort of with leaflets and encouraging people inside as well. And so we had everything. You can see the ones in green are the open events for anyone just to walk in off the street. We also had 2 spaces. We had in the previous image you could see the ground floor space, but there was an upstairs space, which meant we could have kind of more closed sessions upstairs, and we could have more open public access events downstairs. So the green events are public open access events. So we had everything from Climate Museum UK activities, which was amazing to have. And we couldn't have done it was basically run on a budget of, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but about £500.
Yeah.
So it was basically, and that was, I think Mike won a small local community award for that. So that paid for some of the printing. We managed to get some coffees kindly through that for some of our meetings to kind of boost morale on some of those rainy days. But it was made possible because of everybody's volunteer time. So Victoria coming up from the Climate Museum, Farhana coming up to give a guest speaker slot, which was amazing on climate justice. We had the Kirklees Museums and Galleries doing museum in a box activities. We had Willowcraft demonstrations from a charity called Growing Works. We had talks on honeybee conservation. We had poetry in the parlour. So there was everybody's kind of local energy that had already been, I think it also would not have been possible without Mike's kind of massive energy of bringing people together for months and months before this. Because then in that relatively short period of time of a few months, we were able to kind of then gather together everyone to create this program. There were a few, you can see the red ones are a few closed events. So there was an interfaith discussion on the Friday, and Victoria's Climate Museum UK workshop for cultural leaders was a closed workshop as well. You can see it happened to be, this week happened to coincide with university and college union strikes. And the location of this is very close to the university. So I checked in with Mike and everybody else on the organizing team, would it be okay to run some teach outs? So rather than running our lectures, which we weren't doing because we were on strike, we also ran sort of mini lectures, mini seminars in the upstairs room. And you can see those in blue. So what that did also was it brought people together. So people who hadn't heard of Culture Declares an Emergency, people who maybe weren't even necessarily involved in climate action, but were politically active in the union, were coming in as well and were joining in some of the other events, and vice versa. So people from the, coming for the climate events were then also coming to the teach outs, which were, sometimes they were on things like, there was a death cafe, there was learning through social action. So, things that were sort of relevant, but also more academic, potentially. So I'll show you some pictures of some of the events. Victoria, if you could get to the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, there you can see the Willowcraft demos, and you can see the location also of the hub is right opposite the library, the main library in Huddersfield. And on the right there, you can see some of the Climate Museum UK, amazing boards that we were able to borrow, and much more kind of interactive activities where people could stick things up and their ideas up with Post-its. There's the sustainable fashion and low waste products on the bottom. So we had Pura Shop was selling kind of reusable, low emissions products. And on, I think the last day on Saturday, there was a group who were focusing on sustainable fashion. Could you get to the next slide, please, Victoria? Thank you. And there you can see, an example of the teach outs in the rooms upstairs. So it looks very familiar as a kind of seminar space. But what was nice was it was open to everybody as well. So it was a real mixing of different communities, which you don't, I think that was one of the strengths of the hub, was that you had people from the university, people from all the different local groups coming together, and had some amazing comments of people saying, oh, we would have never come to this kind of event, or we would have never heard this kind of material being taught, or we would have not learned about these experiences. And on the right there, you can see an art installation by one of the students in the sound art program called Drip. And it was really, really, it's a shame we don't have the sound for you to listen, but he had a little separate room and people could come in there and listen to the sound art that he produced. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And then we did on the Thursday night, we had Farhana Yamin come and give a talk on climate justice, which I think, unfortunately, because of the impending fear of coronavirus, I think it wasn't as well attended as we'd hoped, but everyone who came was really, really inspired, and we're hoping to still produce a short video of that. So that is still gonna hopefully reach a larger audience then too. So with that kind of support, like with Farhana's support, with Victoria's support, all voluntary, we really were able to put together this exciting program of events. So yeah, I don't know, Mike, if you want to say any more about the hub? Anything I've missed out?
Not really. I think that covers it. It was a great collaboration from everybody. I think we did some set of design principles. I'd seen Permaculture Association had got some brilliant design principles, and we set some up and agreed them as a group. And one of them was that we would follow the enthusiasm. So we didn't go for, if people weren't interested, we didn't worry about that. We didn't have time. But if people were keen, we just went with the enthusiasm. And everything you saw on that program was from a really enthusiastic response from people. So it's a good tip for us in the future. I think we'll follow the enthusiasm in future too. So thanks to everybody who contributed it. And it was great. It was great that Farhana came up and gave such a inspirational talk on the Thursday evening. So
yeah, and something I don't think I did mention was that we had, because the intention was also to think that we've got this one pop-up hub for this 1 week, but that if it went well and, you know, learning from that event, that we would then hopefully have more, and maybe in different locations around Kirklees. And so the theme for this one we decided on was water, and with the idea that the future ones might have other themes.
yeah, I think with the recent flooding and lots of, like, Eliot's art installation was all about water and its implications for the climate emergency. We put Simon Armitage's poems on the wall, stanza stones. We got permission and hoped he would come, but we've not. Simon's from Marsden in Kirklees, and we keep getting in touch with his agent, but he's not. We've not had any direct involvement yet, but we live in hope.
So I was wondering whether Victoria or Farhana, if either of you wanted to just say something about your involvement in the hub and what your perception of it, and as kind of visitors.
Yeah, well, sorry, Farhana, you go.
Oh, no, you go ahead. You go ahead. I'll come on after you.
Oh, well, you know, it was, you know, much as the photos do it justice, and it was in a kind of, it was a perfect piece of sort of guerrilla commoning in a, you know, a rundown part of the sort of shopping centre, but very central, and people did sort of see through the window and were sort of invited in. So there's a lot of just people coming in off the street, and it was just a lovely diversity of sort of activities and a lovely energy. And so I had 2 hats on there, which was my Culture Declares and Climate Museum. And Climate Museum it's a mobile museum, pop-up and digital museum, which captures and stirs emotions around the climate and ecological emergency. And we did both elements of our work, which is the public facing work and also professional workshop. And it's based on sort of engaging with emotions, because you can't, you know, tackle the climate emergency unless you engage with the emotions. So it's really to start with sort of entry points of sort of how are you feeling about this, and then you generate a conversation, and that can be through games and play. And then with the professional workshops, we focused. It was a workshop for Analyse and Act, which looked at the emergency from a kind of systemic and cultural perspective. And again, it was from whatever way in people came, and we started off with talking about how they felt about the emergency, and, you know, and a lot of people talked about the recent flooding. And we introduced this idea that we have called Positopia, which is not a utopian idea, it's what a possible futures can be, and they're achievable ones, which went down very well. So it's really sort of what were their actionable impacts as an organisation or as cultural professionals. Yeah, I think it worked really well, and I enjoyed it very much, and was sort of in awe of what both Mike and Anna had achieved in such a small space of time. So Farhana.
Yeah, it was fantastic to have actually your pop-up, you know, sort of wanting to get up and running at the tail end of when we were, you know, resting in after that 6-week period. So knowing that there was demand for, you know, an interest, you know, really helped us a lot, and helped us also sell to the council a little bit more that they couldn't just shut this space down, you know. So I want to really say thank you, you know, even from afar, when we were learning about that you'd already got an idea to do this, you know, back in sort of December and January when you wanted to take that forward. It really meant a lot, I think, to a lot of the key people there. My experience of going up was, yeah, in the middle of when we should have actually, now with hindsight, you know, been in lockdown already, right? So I think it was on March the 12th that I came up, and there are so many similarities. Like our Kentish Town one is also opposite the library, actually, and our intent was to set up a pop-up in Kentish Town Library when the Think and Do space physically shut down, which we were expecting to be around the end of March and didn't happen. We were also expecting to do a school summit because a huge number of school children, teachers from the private schools, public schools, state schools also came to do that. So we always had this idea that, you know, let's get these pop-ups going as quickly as possible. And I loved how you were able to have, I had, you know, space envy, because you had two spaces, the upstairs space and the downstairs space. And we didn't have that. We just had basically one big area. And sometimes that didn't create as thoughtful and reflective an experience as perhaps yours did. You know, we had like lots of crazy posters originally up during the early phase one. And a lot of ideas that came, you know, lots of post-its. So yeah, yours looked very beautifully curated, I have to say, and your walls look really nice, and there was a really thoughtful and calm kind of presence, which I thought, you know, for next time we would definitely do that. We did have nicer posters for phase 2. So my thoughts on you know, coming back from that session that I did was again thinking, how can these pop-ups also lead to more and more action? You know, that's basically what I'm in it for, right? So I feel like this needs to translate into deeper action at the end of the day. And there was many comments from, I think a couple of councillors came as well. So you don't have the full buy-in like we do. We have like almost unanimous support. There isn't a detractor and someone saying climate's not important or acting in emergency is not important. You know, we felt very lucky that we had that. And so I think how do you bring people along who are not already in emergency mode? And, you know, that's maybe the more thoughtful, reflective space is helpful for that. And I think using a more cultural sort of lens and experience may be more helpful for bringing people who are already not in that mode already. I think just coming back, I still feel having an ongoing space, a physical space, is really, really important. And I feel like now that we're in this, especially in this Zoom, you know, mode, and we've lost our sort of physical space, you know, it's becoming very apparent to me that we are thirsty for that contact, for that hub, for that connection. And even, you know, I'm trying to get the number 19, the new space, to be available as quickly as possible. So even if we're socially isolated, we can still go to the same place. We can still do things and have that physical connection. That physical connection, I think, is a very important thing. And just the final kind of thing that I think that you guys did really well, and we, partly because we were volunteer and you know, it was kind of slightly crazy, but partly sort of slightly deliberately, I guess, we didn't distill the principles and set them out in that way, because I feel like our pop-up was evolving, you know, evolved from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, and now, you know, COVID's hit it. So it's not that there aren't principles, it's not that there isn't a common DNA. And I feel like that's one of the things maybe we should collaborate and work on sort of after this to support that, because there is a common sort of set of methodologies. You know, start with people where they are, you know, don't impose an agenda, allow relationships to come and, you know, generate and be built on by themselves, you know, without forcing people into, oh, you've got to do this project, you know, accept all manner and variety of projects, be open-ended about this. And I think many of those sort of key principles come also from the way in which many of us work, that have allowed this sort of space to be supportive and neutral and feel convivial and empowering and engender sort of action in the longer term, which I think will serve us very well, as opposed to saying like, we've got to get this and this done. And, you know, and a million projects will come forward, and, you know, most of them will not go anywhere, but actually the projects that have that, you know, relationships and people and that bedrock of, you know, longer term support you know, are going to thrive. And that's what we're finding at the moment, that people had a sort of hiccup now with COVID really knocking them sideways, but those projects are sort of back. And just finally, you know, we were, and Kelly's on this call as well, who's been a brilliant collaborator from CDE side. So if COVID had not come along, we would have had a school summit with major outcomes from all of the Camden schools. It's a borough of 260,000 people. It's bigger than half the small countries in the world, actually. So, and we would have had at Tate Modern, you know, our first non-Camden based sort of pop-up and series of events, you know, bringing culture and Think and Do much more in alignment. And we would have had pop-ups in at least one, if not more, libraries already taking place at this time. So I feel like maybe we're a little bit slow on that, but it gives us time to nurture now what is the sort of principles and how can we best support others coming together, and to work with you guys on that would be an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Farhana. Mike, did you want to talk a little bit about the next steps?
Yeah, I'll just briefly, thanks very much for that, Farhana. I think I couldn't agree more about the importance of the physical space, the amount of connections that came at random through that space. I mean, none of us could even start to write down how many little connections and little inspirations came from it, practical ones as well, where people were saying, can we find out more about this? Or, you know, somebody came through from the university to one of Anna's teach outs, and he worked in the printing section, and they were trying to use dyes that were less damaging to the environment for sustainable fashion and sustainable printing. And the West Yorkshire Print Workshop, who are one of our declaring organisations, are doing exactly that. So we put them in touch. It's things like that that just work so well in a physical space. But I think for us, just very briefly, we're now going to kind of constitute a little bit as a voluntary association. We've put a funding bid into Poldham Pookham to run some more pop-ups over 3 years. And we've been shortlisted for that, so a decision comes at the end of May, so keep your fingers crossed. But importantly, we've also put in for a bit of money to help others to set up in other towns. So we want to be able to share the plans, just as you were saying, Farhana, to almost agree the fundamental not ground rules, but principles that could support others in setting up without trying to define what the actions and the collaborations are in different towns. I'd recommend like that, following the enthusiasm, definitely, because that seems to be what's working for us. I think personally, I'd like to follow up on the enthusiasm from the pop-up in Huddersfield in 3 kind of main areas of public engagement. The first one is the fantastic work that our museums and galleries team did with Museum in a Box, and the work that Climate Museum UK have done in articulating the climate emergency so clearly for people. The second one is the outdoor work that Growing Works are doing locally with wellbeing practice and growing projects, local food projects. So we want to tap into the work to try and support them. And also the radical approach to the commons that Ioanni Del Santi and Tabassum Ahmed are doing locally, which is really interesting. And I know, Farhana, you mentioned the commons and Victoria's mentioned it. I think there's just something a little bit more radical than just a branded use of commercial space that they do, and finding places, underused spaces in towns. There's loads of them. And I just love the idea of being able to sort of do a Waterloo Bridge on them and bring people in, the general public. By putting a few trees in our window for the hub and plants outside, and having Sian out there doing some basket weaving, couldn't believe how many people came in on the basis of that, because it just looked an interesting window display with no corporate branding. So that was good. But I'd really be interested, Ruth, with you on the call today, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what you have in mind. That's all right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Just to give a brief introduction, I'm Ruth Nutter. I'm creative producer of an organisation called the Guild of St George. So for the last few years, and I'm on the call with Malika Cunningham as well, who runs the Bear Project in Sheffield. We've been working together quite a lot over the last few years. I've been running a community engagement project called Ruskin in Sheffield, running mainly pop-up events in parks, in disused shops, in shopping centres, and I've been doing it probably in total for 10 years. So thank you very much to Mike and Farhana and Anna for sharing your experience of them, because I see so many similarities and synergies, and they're just the most fantastic tool for bringing people together and enabling them to talk about what matters to them. So Malika and I have worked together for the last few years, and particularly around a festival called A Future Fantastic, which was looking at just engaging people around policies, performance, installation, around things that matter, forward looking into the future, looking at environment, looking at fairness at work. And yeah, so yeah, that's my introduction. In terms of Culture Declares Sheffield, what happened, I think, is that over the last few years, because I've been so networked in communities and with some of the bigger cultural organisations in Sheffield, I just realised that actually not many of them had declared. Malika was involved in a What Next session in Sheffield, which was focused around climate. And at the end of it, we agreed that we were going to really try and galvanise and bring more people on board to declare in Sheffield. So where we'd got up to was we were planning an assembly this spring, which obviously can't happen. We'd like that to happen physically. There's a kind of fairly low sign up in terms of arts and culture in Sheffield to Culture Declares, whereas there's kind of massive grassroots climate action. So we just wanted to redress that balance really and bring arts and culture on board. We're just kind of pondering at the moment, I think it's fair to say, that the best way to do that. And the most sort of likely way that we will bring people on board, I think, is through Malika and I have been both very involved in the Climate Action Fund bid in Sheffield. I don't know if anyone else has been involved in that, but it's the national lottery scheme which towns, villages, cities can apply for to basically inspire citizens to reduce their carbon emissions. And at the heart of that, Malika and I were really we're working on this idea of a creative climate action, a city centre hub. We're working with 35 partners across Sheffield to kind of put this bid together. And the idea would be that we would have 18 months or about a year of a climate action hub and a community listening project at the same time. We'll find out in June whether that bid is successful, and I think that will be the really good spur to actually bring cultural organisations together and declare at that point. It just feels like there'll be some real momentum and sense of purpose. But yeah, so it's a little bit open at the moment still. Malika, do you want to say anything?
I feel like you've covered most of what I would have said anyway, in terms of where we're up to and what we hope to do next. But yeah, this has been a great talk to join, just to hear about what's been going on in Camden and Kirklees, because it's definitely stuff that we've kind of been working on in Sheffield already, but definitely hope to scale up over the next couple of years. So yeah, great.
I guess one other sort of point I've been trying to reply in chat so I don't take up all the space is the governance and must come from the people who arrive and be gestated and led by them. So I've sort of again resisted too much formalization, because if you do that, you know, you're already putting in place a structure which may not be appropriate for the people who want to start something. So, you know, for some people, it could be that you've just got 3 people and that's what you decide to do. And you have it for, I feel like, 1 day a month, or, you know, a whole day just as a one-off, you know. So the template for us is to have as light a governance structure that's most appropriate for these efforts, because the key thing is to get started and to accept that you don't have the answers and that no one else has them for you either. And that comes from where I came from. My story, I guess, is, you know, part of having done intense amount of 3 decades of work with the modeling community, and like with lots and lots of scientists who are working out scenarios of how to get emissions reductions and a better society and all the rest of it. And nearly all of those efforts, I think Paul Allen's work at, you know, CAT is one of the better ones, but nearly all of those efforts don't involve people. They already decide what the world will look like in 4 or 5 different scenarios. So if we're going for an imagination-led approach, you kind of have to leave quite a lot blank, basically, and leave it blank. It's quite hard to keep that blankness there. Yeah, that's, which is hard for funders. So, and again, the funding has to come from resources. So apart from the 600 hours of council staff time in the first 2 months, there was double that from the community itself, and the community ran a cafe and provided food and stuff nearly for 3 days, you know, full time itself. The community has to provide its own resources.
Yeah, I think there's so much room for different ways of running these hubs. I know that I think the one in Kirklees was different in that I think somebody on the chat, earlier asked about how much the council had been involved, and they hadn't really been involved in ours. Some councillors attended and got involved in the questions, but we kind of kept it deliberately non-political. We didn't get any. We got £500 of funding from Cohesion Kirklees, a department in the council, but it wasn't any direct support or engagement in the work of that hub. But it's great that there's just so much room for different models to pop up as they've been doing for years, as you said, Ruth, in Sheffield. So
what I found about Camden was the number of like-minded groups that convened and came together and shared so much action locally that was just already there. Lots of shared commitments, shared desires about reimagining the high street, and every event was incredibly well supported. It was quite bowled over with the amount of energy and commitment that went into it, and it did seem to sort of appear out of nothing. But I think the most relevant thing was to have it in such a prominent position, and to be so sort of suddenly find something that was quite very run down and almost ignored. And Kentish Town High Street has got lots of issues, and there's so many empty shop fronts. So to suddenly create something and give it some life with a lot of action, it just seemed to be a magnet in the area and drew a lot of very like-minded, very energetic people together. And it was a really inspiring period of time.
Mm.
I wonder, Anna, if we should go straight to the, we were going to do a breakout. Do you want to, but maybe given the number of people we have and the limitation on time, we should just pitch these questions and invite everyone to chip in with a Q&A, either by chat or just by unmuting yourselves.
Yeah, I think that would be really good, because we've already got a bit of a discussion going, and rather than going into breakout groups, if we could just carry on the discussion and maybe focusing around questions like, would a kind of local culture declares group or a pop-up hub work in your local area? There's already been some chats in the little chat box about going to much smaller communities of like 6,000 people. Would that be very different? Why would it be different? Would it work? Why not? Or as Farhana says, just get going. Or if anyone has any questions as to how to just get going, things like that. And the other question we thought of was, how can we do this local collaborative work without the physical space at the moment? And And even if we're going to go back, you know, into slightly more normal conditions, there will still likely be some form of physical distancing. So how will that impact our activities and our work? And do we have any creative ideas as to how to work around that? Or any other questions that anyone has, just opening it up.
Do you want those questions put in the chat, Anna, initially?
I think it would be easier to put them in the chat, but if anybody has, anything to say, please do also speak.
I think, Anna, just in response to you were just talking about, you know, sort of posters coming out of lockdown and the need for those physical spaces. I kind of made a conscious decision not to try and engage people really digitally during this phase, partly because we normally engage really wide range of people, and I think many of those people won't even be online. It certainly won't be there at the forefront of their mind, be, you know, wanting to engage with these kinds of things at the moment online. And I just think there's a really strong role for them, even more. I think I've seen them work so well in neighbourhoods. The more local, the better. Actually, they can work very well in city centres, but I just think it's almost like there will be a need for them at the end of every road after this. The more local, the better. And I think that there's real scope to work creatively and be kind of listening posts where people can maybe come in small numbers or at a distance, because those pop-up spaces can work well when they're bustling and busy, and they can work well when there's one person in there. So that's my feeling, is that we keep thinking and refining how we use these spaces sort of as we come out of lockdown. I think there's great scope.
Can I say something? Hello?
Yeah, go on, Selina.
Thank you. I was just thinking, I love the idea of the pop-up spaces in sort of anywhere really, that you, and particularly locally, but odd places. And that is something that we can do with physical distancing fairly soon, I think, maybe in the summer sometime. And I mean, I'm involved in a community orchard, and that's a really great outdoor space, because really it's a field with, and it's really out quite remote really, and people can walk to it, and it's somewhere where you could arrange some sort of activity, or a way in which people could have a space really for them to step into, where they might have some way of having a think about what they might like to do. So it would become an outdoor kind of thinking space, as well as the potential for doing space. So I suppose looking for places like that, because it is a bounded space in the sense that, you know, it's got a gate and you go in, and it's got that sort of sense of a containment, which I think is quite helpful if you want to set something up. You know, sometimes street corners can be quite difficult, although they can be really good too, but in a different way. Okay, that was just a thought that came up.
Thank you.
Can I say something? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. Hi, everybody. This was just so inspirational. And just in terms of that last question about, it is difficult to get people going remotely and without that kind of physical connection and exchange. But it seems to me that this conversation is a brilliant starting point. And you say it's going to be available on YouTube, because I can think of somebody locally across the street who's a teacher who I'd love to share this conversation, this session with, as a starting point for us then to throw some ideas around. We're both volunteers at our local village library, which is run on a volunteer basis. So it's just about those small steps which can then go into action once the lockdown begins to be eased. So I think this is a fantastic resource, as well as some of the links that have been put up. So thank you.
Thank you, Rose.
I add to that. Hello, everybody. At the moment here at home in Manchester, it's the Art Centre in Manchester, we've kind of had to have a bit of a rethink about how we're continuing to engage with environmental sustainability, with action, with culture declares, but also Manchester's climate change partnership action plan. So we were just about to embark on how do we reduce our emissions by 50% in the next 5 years. Well, at the moment our building's not using much, which is good, but one of the things that we're trying to do is sort of regroup and get everybody together in terms of staff online. So using our online teams, setting up a channel that involves with engaging with climate action, but different aspects of it, but also individual actions and neighbourhood actions. So at the moment we're doing a bit of work in terms of getting everybody on board as a workforce. So those of you who are online or who are part of those different sorts of communities, maybe there's a way to sort of engage with that locally, and then with sort of pooling resources and also learning more about the wider Greater Manchester networks and what's going on in people's individual organisations, whereas sometimes that would previously be a bit of a conversation at the counter in the kitchen in the green room. Now we've got a platform to do that online, so collating that to figure out where we can go with it next, but also engaging with our workforce, but also the online community. But yeah, definitely very much next steps about thinking about how we continue to grow that, especially with those people that we aren't reaching socially online yet.
No. Thank you, Alison. Great. Where are we? We've got 5 minutes. More questions or anyone? Observations?
Hi there. We're sort of working in it's not a culture declares group as such. We're kind of working alongside supporting the council, representing residents in the area, and sort of supporting the climate declaration and what that means in terms of kind of local plans and that sort of thing, and also supporting Dartmoor National Park in their climate emergency declaration. I've been really inspired by this. I'm just thinking some of the examples I've seen. You have populations of like 250,000 and that sort of thing. I think about my town, which is only about 14,000, and it's quite tricky to get things really going in this area. So I'm just wondering how does this? Have you got any examples of this working on a kind of on the scale of like a district, like over various towns and villages in an area? So I'm in Devon, so it's perhaps a bit different to some of those other examples.
I think I mean, if there's the will, even if it's just a handful of you, I just start. I think some of the, actually Heather, you might know, some of the CD anchor group are based in down that way. Am I right?
Totnes.
Totnes.
I think there's quite a hub in Totnes. But there's also lots of creative work that comes out of Exeter, I know.
Yeah.
And around the universities and the art schools.
Yeah. In fact, sorry.
They're not quite they're not really team bridge. They're like on the edges. It'd be great to have some more stuff going on here. I'm kind of busy with different things, but it'd be great if there is like a network that I could connect with of local people. I don't know, I guess I could do my local XR group or something, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's just about making those connections yourself and then building it up from there, and using the resources that CDE have. In fact, on the 17th of June, there's going to be an offer you might want to come to, which is is coming out of Exeter University and the Eden Centre. So you might make some connections through that.
Great, thank you.
So
I'll leave it there. You can.
Victoria, there's a very good question that's come up from Pip on chat that you might need to respond to.
Hi, yeah, it was just around the insights that I gathered and how that feeds back into kind of policy and academic institutes.
From the academic perspective, because I mean, I'm an academic myself, and Yanni, who's doing the offer this evening, was also involved. And we've been working on a funding bid on the academic side. to try and, yeah, to do some of this kind of work, to think about how, you know, what role culture plays in climate emergency. So there will be outputs coming out of that, but academia is quite slow, unfortunately. On the policy side, that's something, yeah, we need to think about, whether we write shorter kind of policy oriented papers as well. It's a good idea. I hadn't thought about that. I think we've been so focused on getting the hub done and then now COVID-19 straight afterwards. So it's good to think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be cool to connect maybe afterwards, because I'm part of Imperial and we're like trying to kick off a big part of work, basically doing the same thing. So it'd be cool to kind of learn from each other. And cool.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we're approaching. We're on finished our time, unfortunately. But I'd just like to thank Mike, Anna, Farhana, Kelly, and Polly, who was also from CDU. I think she's gone now, for helping us host this session, and for all of you for taking part. I will copy some of the information from the chat and think about a way that we circulate that. So, I mean, just make sure you're signed up to our mailing lists, and if you haven't already, please have a look at the route to declaring, and maybe consider what you could do in your area, your own localities. And if you need any support with anything, then please email Culture Declares and we'll try and hook you up and make those connections. And lastly, Mike, would you like to just talk a little bit about tonight?
Yeah, so as we've said, Ioani and Davidson, who've been heavily involved in the work through this year, Ioani's leading a session tonight on the commons and commoning and community action. So it's very much sort of the material that he's going to use. It's an interactive session, but beyond that, and from what I've shown already about the work they've been doing here in Huddersfield and in the University of Pavia in Italy, he's going to be, I think it's going to be quite an inspirational session. I'm looking forward to it myself, but I'm not aware of all the content. But they're very active in the area of the commons. And I mean, Davidson got me in touch with this book, Patterns of Commoning, which has got loads of examples around the world of different commons. There's commons in digital, commons in culture, commons in the outdoors. And I think they're really short articles, but I think the work that they've been doing is very specific, and it's been a collaboration with the University of Pavia. I think it's going to be a really good event. Thanks.
Right, brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, and hope to see some of you back here again. And yes, stay healthy